winter of 1852 pressed down on Beaufort County like a held breath air sharp as broken glass, pines standing in a hush that felt like warning. Far from the city lamps of Charleston, the Harding plantation stretched over 800 acres of long staple cotton, a pale quilt stitched to the Combe River by wagon ruts and footsteps that never chose their direction. The big house lifted its white columns against a colorless sky, a pretty mask for a machine that ran on fear. Wind scraped shingles and rattled shutters, but what truly traveled through the fields from Quarters to Gins to the muddy banks was a rumor that had the weight of certainty. Punishment lived here, and it had a scent. They called them bloodhounds with the same casual authority they used for ledgers and weather. 6 dogs housed in purpose-built kennels near the main steps, oak-planked and iron-latched, as if the animals were both prized and dangerous. Ernest Harding, 50, heavy in the jowls, heavy in his convictions, spoke of discipline the way a preacher speaks of salvation. His son Jasper, 25, and unbroken by doubt, wore cruelty like a fitted coat and believed it made him efficient. One brought order, the other enjoyed it. Together they tuned a plantation until it sang the miserable note they required. When a body ran, the dogs ran faster. When a heart broke, it broke quietly. The dogs knew every scent. Along that river, cut fox, heron, swamp musk, crushed cottonleaf, terrified, sweat. They were kept lean on purpose, muscle-wired tight beneath brindled hide. And when their meal pans scraped, the sound vibrated a promise through every plank of the slave quarters. News of hounds traveled far in those years. An overseer's whip raised scars, but a pack left a story. Throughout the low country, dogs and chains formed a single vocabulary, and everyone understood its grammar. You can run, the dogs will follow, and if they catch you, the woods will remember your voice, but not your name. In that world, a boy named Simon learned the shape of obedience. Born in 1832 on Harding land, he showed too early the kind of attention that makes owners curious and overseers suspicious. At 14, he was pulled from rows and handed a different yoke, the care and handling of the bloodhounds. Ernest called it trust. The quarters understood it as a test with no safe answers. Simon learned the fat content of scraps. The way winter hunger sharpened a dog's patience, the small science of scent. How a thread of sweat nested inside wool. How river air ate the edge off a trail at dawn. How a body in terror broadcast itself long after it had disappeared from sight. He learned to keep his face closed while his eyes stayed open. From those kennels he could see the big house and the pillory in the yard between the quarters, a pin of beaten earth glistening after rain. Punishments were public because terror must be witnessed to be efficient. There was economy in it. A whip cracked, and 12 families straightened their backs at once. An overseer first thorn. Later, Garrett counted the lashes aloud, and with each number, an invisible sum grew inside those who watched. The dogs slept. Through lash 8, woke at lash 9, and by lash 10, their tails were thudding. The trained part of Simon recorded the detail as data. Noise excites them. Blood excites them more. The human part filed it as a second list. Names of the whipped, reasons given, reasons real. He moved like a shadow. No one bothered to chase. In the morning he mixed rations, cut scraps, salted lightly in winter to keep the dogs thirsty. At noon he mended harness and checked nails along kennel doors. At dusk he walked the runs, counted food barrels, and listened to the pack breathe. Some nights he was told to ready a scent rag and hand it over without words. He would fix his eyes on the floorboards as the rag disappeared into Jasper's fist. Then later, from the far trees, hear the layered music of pursuit, men crashing, dogs baying, the single wild instrument of a hunted throat. The next day, the quarter-yard would grow a new stain, each record stored, each hour tallied, each cruelty catalogued until the book inside his skull had too many pages to lift. Beyond the fence line, the river kept its own time. Barges drifted cotton south. Letters came north promising prices and prayers. Newspapers from Charleston brought arguments about tariff and union. But the paper everyone read here was a body that had learned to flinch at footfalls. Ernest preferred numbers to conversations. He could list yields for the previous 10 years and the cost of nails in Charleston, and if you asked him about dogs, he'd tell you the breed line of each, where he bought them, what he paid. Jasper preferred comparisons. He liked to explain how other places were worse so that this place could be forgiven. He called that perspective. Winter rearranged the order of the day. Frost set a glittering crust on the fields, shortening labor and lengthening hunger. Smoke from the big house kitchen drifted lower, and the smell of pork fat meant nothing to those who tasted it only on Sundays. In the tea quarters, quilts were patched, feet were wrapped in burlap when leather split, and morning bell came late enough that the sun had at least considered rising. Under that season's hush, routines tightened, fewer trips to the river, more eyes on the yard, dogs kept a little leaner. Suspicion, like fire, takes less air in winter. It was then that Simon's quiet deepened and hardened. Those who shared a wall with him would later say he breathed like a sleeper practicing wakefulness. He kept to simple roots, the kennel, the yard, the smokehouse, the springs, and he timed himself with the certainty of a man who knows that certainty is life. He watched Ernest's steps, the long pause before he buttoned a coat, the private check of his watch at the door. He watched Jasper's gait, the impatience that made him cut corners, the laziness that made him careless. He noted how the dogs behaved on days when air didn't move, and how their heads turned as one at the faintest clang of iron. Every new piece of knowledge fit an old idea. The pack itself taught him more than any man ever did. A dog is honest with its needs, and in honesty there is pattern. Cold makes hunger a hammer. Fat makes sleep a promise. Noise pulls attention. Pain sharpens it. Dogs remember what feeds them. Dogs forgive what feeds them. He did the arithmetic without letting the total show in his face. If fear had been the Harding's tool, he could learn its weight. If dogs had been their spell, he could learn the words. Beyond Harding's fences, the South held to its contradictions. In town, men argued by firelight about rights and property as if both had the same breath. In parlors, daughters practiced piano, while ledgers recorded purchases made of human lives that never touched those keys. A few miles away, pamphlets, in careful hands, whispered abolition in rooms where doors were closed and voices lower still. Ideas traveled like contraband, and the most dangerous among them said, "This order is neither natural nor eternal." But that winter, the plantation's calendar refused such theory. Cotton bales waited on dry days. Jars of fat were counted, and the dogs' bowls were set down with a clank that meant all discussions were over. Simon's face gave nothing away. It was the first skill he mastered and the last he meant to forget. He nodded when spoken to. He looked at the ground when he was meant to. He answered short in a tone that suggested no interior. Those who commanded him saw competence and called it loyalty. Those who slept a few feet away from him saw rhythm and called it survival. He carried himself like a man wedged between gears who had figured out how not to be crushed. Privilege, such as it was free movement between kennels and kitchen, the right to handle keys, had a price, and the price was to wear visibility like a cloak of invisibility. He wore it well. The pillory boards had gone gray with use. Rain washed them and sun-dried them until the grain rose like scar tissue under a hand. Simon never touched that wood. He did not need to. He could tell you which notch matched which man, where a wrist had jerked, so often the iron had carved a groove. He could tell you which shoes had scuffed, which patch of dirt, where the faint sheen meant a woman had collapsed to her knees. Knowledge can be kindness. Here, it was a map. In December, the Hardings spoke of Charleston. After harvest came business, samples to show, bills to pay, men to impress, and men to believe. Ernest handled schedules and letters, Jasper the swagger and the talk. The trip was their custom, as much a part of the season as frost. Workers in the yard noticed the routine that always preceded departure, the way trunks came down from the attic, the way the carriage was checked twice, the way Jasper rehearsed, a joke no one in the house had the courage to dislike. That winter, the bustle had a second edge, the arguments. With Adelaide, the daughter recently returned from school, who asked too many questions in rooms that were not built for questions. It was a thin crack in a stone step. Most men learn to avoid such cracks when the air turns slick. Most men, not all, on the morning cold enough to make breath look like mistakes. Simon stood in the kennel's half-light and let 6 pairs of eyes decide whether the day had already chosen its meaning. Steel bowls rang, tails thudded. He measured, by sound instead of clock, by hunger instead of time, how quickly the meat vanished, how long they licked the bottoms. He set the latches with practiced hands, each click a note in a song he could play without thinking. Outside, the sun dragged itself over the trees, reluctant and pale. Inside, something else rose with it, harder, quieter, built of memory, nailed to opportunity. Around here, the winter taught 2 truths: cold preserves and cold conceals. Footprints kept their shape longer. Blood sank and disappeared, quicker when the ground wore ice like a mask. And people owners, overseers, enslaved, walked closer to the lines. They drew in summer. Some lines, if watched long enough, reveal where they are weakest. Simon had been watching for 8 years. He knew where the frost thinned. He knew which sound would carry and which would not. He knew that the dogs do not ask the difference between command and permission. And he knew that in a place where fear had been raised, like a house frame, the first blow must be struck so cleanly that the whole structure forgot how to stand. The wind moved once across the yard and was still again. Somewhere in the big house, Jasper laughed at nothing. Somewhere in the quarters, a child coughed at everything. Somewhere unnamed, a plan completed the distance between thought and fact. If you had seen Simon, then you might have thought him a boy at his chores, replacing a lid, checking a hinge. If you had watched a heartbeat longer, you might have noticed the smallest pause in his breath. Winter held it for him. Then he exhaled, and the day resumed its ordinary cruelty, which is to say its perfect cover. The Harding plantation wore its cruelty like a second skin, and every person who lived there, whether master, overseer, or enslaved, understood the rhythm of its brutality. The days began before dawn, when the sharp clang of Jasper, Harding's bell, split the dark. It was not just an alarm. It was a declaration of power. 22 slaves stirred from cramped cabins, dragging their weary bodies into the biting cold. Breakfast was a thin porridge, sometimes laced with moldy cornmeal, and on rare days a strip of rancid pork that was fuel enough for 12 hours of backbreaking labor beneath a winter sky that offered no warmth. The Hardings believed punishment was more effective when public, and so the pillory stood tall in the yard, stained, dark from years of flesh and blood. Simon, tending to the hounds nearby, had the misfortune of witnessing these events with more clarity than anyone else. He learned not to flinch when the first crack of the whip broke silence, nor when screams rose and fell like the tide. Overseer Leonis Garrett conducted these rituals with cold precision. Unlike his predecessor Thorne, who had savored cruelty with a sadist's grin, Garrett treated violence as a tool of management. His whip, braided leather tipped with metal, ripped skin into ribbons that fluttered against the victim's back. Each lash was calculated not just to wound the body, but to carve obedience into the minds of those watching. Simon became a master of invisibility. In these moments he stood, still, eyes lowered, his face a mask of apathy, yet within he recorded every sound, every plea for mercy, every name called out by loved ones. He carried these memories like sharpened stones in his chest, and each one found its place in a growing monument to vengeance. Hatred, when nurtured in silence, does not burn wildly, it calcifies. For the enslaved community, survival required silence. They could not protest nor even show sympathy without risking the lash themselves. But silence was not the same as acceptance. In hushed tones at night, when the wind rattled the thin shutters of their cabins, families whispered stories of endurance. They told children that the pain they saw was not permanent, that one day justice would come. But for Simon, justice was not a distant dream. It was a plan slowly taking shape, sharpened by each scream that echoed across the yard. He studied not just the hounds, but the Hardings themselves. Nest was methodical, almost ritualistic in his habits. He walked the fields at the same hour every afternoon, checked ledgers with the same exactness each night, and inspected the kennels weekly with a suspicion that could have been mistaken for care. Jasper, on the other hand, was impulsive. He enjoyed improvising cruelty, yanking a slave from the line just to remind the others, who held the power. This recklessness made him feared, but it also made him sloppy. Simon, with his sharp memory, noticed every careless gesture where Jasper left keys, which locks he never checked, which tools he borrowed and forgot to return. The plantation itself was a stage where fear was constantly rehearsed. Nights were punctuated by sudden raids into the slave quarters, Garrett storming in with a lantern and Whip searching for infractions that rarely existed, a misplaced hoe, a hushed conversation, or simply the bad luck of meeting his gaze. Each could spark violence. To the Hardings, these displays weren't excess, they were necessary. Fear was cheaper than chains, more efficient than bars. But beneath this suffocating order, there existed another rhythm, quieter, slower, patient. It was the rhythm of observation. Simon knew which cabins leaked when it rained, which families shared their rations in secret, which slaves had the strength to endure, and which were breaking under the weight of hopelessness. He knew when Garrett's patrols became lazy, when Ernest's suspicions sharpened, and when Jasper's arrogance blinded him to danger. To Simon, each piece of knowledge was a tool. There were nights when he lay awake in the straw, listening to the faint bay of the hounds. To most slaves, those sounds were nightmares incarnate. But to Simon, they were lessons. He knew the difference between a hunger bay and a hunting bay, between a bark that meant confusion and one that meant triumph. He knew how to starve the dogs just enough to make them ferocious, and how to feed them in ways that lulled them into contentment. The Hardings thought this knowledge made him their most valuable slave. They had no idea it was arming him for something far more dangerous. Beyond the plantation fences, the world was shifting. Newspapers carried debates about abolition and states' rights. Though such talk rarely reached enslaved ears, yet whispers traveled, rumors of escapes on the Underground Railroad, of uprisings that had shaken other plantations, of names like Nat Turner that still struck fear into the hearts, of white masters. All of these found their way into the secret conversations in Beaufort County. The Hardings dismissed such things as northern fantasies, but Simon listened with different ears. If others had fought, if others had resisted, why not here? Still, Simon knew that recklessness brought only death. Survival demanded patience, and patience was something he had in abundance. He carried the pain of his people in silence, never allowing anger to slip through the cracks of his mask. Each day of suffering was another layer of steel around his resolve. Each night of cruelty was another page in the ledger he was writing in his mind. When the time came, his justice would not be quick or careless. It would be meticulous, as systematic as the terror that had been inflicted upon him. By the winter of 1852, Simon was 20 years old, and his mask of obedience was flawless. To Ernest and Jasper he was the perfect servant, loyal, silent, efficient. To Garrett he was reliable, a worker who never drew attention to himself. To the other slaves he was a shadow present but unreadable, his true thoughts buried deeper than any overseer could dig. Yet in the quiet of the kennel, as the dogs gnawed their bones and the cold pressed against the walls, Simon nurtured something no lash could beat out of him. The certainty that one day the fear would shift, that those who had hunted with hounds would learn what it meant to be hunted themselves. If the Harding plantation was a theater of fear, then the tragedy that defined Simon's life began with the cruelest performance of all the shattering of his family. His sister, Ella Lenina, was 17 in 1849, a girl whose presence carried a light that no amount of hardship could dim. Her laughter, rare though it was in the slave quarters, could soften the edges of exhaustion. Her eyes, bright and full of defiance, reminded everyone that beauty and hope could exist, even in the darkest corners of bondage. But beauty was dangerous under slavery. It marked her not as someone to be admired, but as prey. Moray Thorne, the overseer before Leonis Garrett, was a man whose name alone was enough to turn stomachs. Tall, broad, with a face creased by a permanent sneer, he embodied the most sadistic instincts of the system. Whipping was not just a duty for him, it was entertainment, but his true cruelty fell upon young women, those whom he forced into silence with threats that reached deeper than the lash. For Ella Lenina. The nightmare began when Thorne's eyes lingered too long. His orders became excuses, and his threats grew specific. At first she resisted him. She found ways to avoid being alone. In his presence, clung to the protection of communal labor, and prayed her beauty might somehow fade beneath the grit of endless toil. But resistance had limits. One night, Thorne cornered her near the barn. When she turned her face away, he whispered a promise that froze her to the marrow. If she continued to defy him, he would have Simon thrown to the bloodhounds. The image was so vivid, so monstrous, that her courage broke. To protect her brother, Ella Lenina surrendered herself to Thorne's abuse. The assaults continued in silence, carried out in barns, empty rooms of the big house, even near the kennels, as a sick reminder of the power Thorne held. Each encounter hollowed her, where once she carried herself with an almost defiant dignity. She now moved like a shadow of her former self. She startled at noises, avoided the gaze of others, and began washing her hands compulsively as though trying to cleanse herself of stains that water could never remove. Simon noticed, though she never confessed. He saw her smiles vanish, her voice falter, her back curve under an invisible weight. He asked questions, but she dodged them, protecting him even as she was being destroyed. The truth revealed itself not in words, but in her body. By late summer of 1849, her belly swelled with a child she could not explain. The quarters understood immediately, though no one dared to name the father aloud. To speak of such things was to invite punishment upon all. Silence became their shield. But silence could not stop the rumors that burned in Simon's chest. When Ernest Harding learned of Ella Lenina's pregnancy, his reaction was not outrage, not sympathy, but calculation. A pregnant slave was an investment, but also a disruption. To him, the solution was simple: sell her. Within days, arrangements were made with a trader from Savannah. The speed was chilling. She was examined like livestock, prodded and inspected in front of strangers. Her teeth were checked, her muscles pressed. Her pregnancy confirmed by a humiliating touch. The price was set: $800. Satisfactory, Ernest declared, as though he were bartering for feed. The day she was taken, Simon stood near the big house, forced to watch, with an expression as blank as he could manage. Chains rattled as Ella climbed into the wagon, joining other souls bound for markets further south. Her eyes found Simon's one final time, brimming with terror and love. He wanted to run to her, to break the chains, to fight until the earth swallowed him, but he did not move. He knew that one reckless act would condemn not only himself, but others, so he stood still as the wagon rolled away, his body a mask, while his heart splintered. That night, the quarters were quieter than usual. No one spoke of Alanina, though all felt her absence like a wound. For Simon, silence was no longer a shield. It was a prison. The fury he carried was not hot, but cold, the kind that does not burn out. It calcified into something else, an iron determination. The blow that followed shattered what little remained of his family. Dorinda, his mother, had endured decades of slavery, losing her husband to sail when Simon was a boy, burying friends and kin in the swampy graveyard behind the quarters. She had bent beneath all of it, but she had not broken. Yet when Ella was sold, something in her gave way. She stopped eating, moved less each day, and let her eyes drift into distances no one else could see. Within 6 months, she was gone. Simon found her lifeless body one cold morning in March 1850. Her face was strangely peaceful, as if death had returned to her something life had stolen. The burial was quiet, performed in the swampy patch of land where enslaved bodies were laid in unmarked graves. Muds sucked at their feet, the air smelled of rot, and the only markers were crude wooden crosses that time quickly erased. Simon stood at her grave with his fists clenched, his expression a mask, but inside him something irrevocable shifted. His grief hardened into resolve. From that day forward, Simon became a different man. To the Hardings he appeared unchanged, dutiful, silent, reliable. But those who knew him sensed the difference. His silences grew longer, his gaze sharper, his movements deliberate. He was no longer just surviving. He was waiting. And then, in the summer of 1350, Thorn was found dead. His body lay in the forest near the plantation, his skull cracked as though from a fall, his flesh torn by what authorities claimed were animal teeth. Officially, it was an accident during a hunt, but the dogs had been restless that morning, pacing their kennels, their muzzles wet with something that looked too much like blood. Simon had an alibi confirmed by many, yet those who watched him closely swore they saw a subtle change in him after Thorn's death, a quiet satisfaction, a loosening of some invisible chain. It was the first act in a play that had only just begun. The death of Maria Thorne in the summer of 1850 was written down as an accident. The coroner's ink barely dried on the page before the case was closed. Men like Thorne did not earn elegies. Their passing was acknowledged with shrugs, muttered remarks about bad luck and a quick burial. Yet for those who lived under his shadow, his death felt different, like a storm cloud suddenly cut open by light. Whispers flickered through the quarters, too soft to be heard by white ears. Some said God had finally answered prayers. Others dared to suspect something more deliberate. And though no one spoke it aloud, many eyes glanced toward Simon. He gave them nothing. His face remained as unreadable as ever, but in the stillness of his body, in the quiet poise of his movements, there was a sense of release, not joy, not even relief, but something sharper, quieter, as though a weight had been shifted from his shoulders. For Simon, Thorne's death was not an end. It was a lesson, a reminder that those who seemed untouchable could bleed, could fall, could be devoured. Lioness Garrett arrived weeks later to fill the role of overseer. Where Thorne had been loud in his cruelty, Garrett was systematic. He believed order was maintained not through sadistic indulgence but through consistency. Whipping became less theatrical, but no less brutal. Garrett kept records, imposed quotas, and treated flesh as another tool to be managed. If Thorne was a predator who hunted for sport, Garrett was a craftsman who believed pain was part of his trade. For the enslaved, the difference meant little. The lash still cut, the pillory still stained, and screams still punctuated the rhythm of labor. But for Simon, Garrett's arrival created a new environment. Without Thorne's unpredictable lust for power, Simon had space to perfect his craft of invisibility. He became a model slave in the eyes of the Hardings. His tasks at the kennels were completed with precision. He never raised his voice, never faltered in his duties, never gave cause for suspicion. Yet beneath that mask his mind sharpened like a blade. He began to study not just the Hardings, but the plantation itself. He mapped every corner in memory, the paths Garrett patrolled, the weak spots in the fences, the curves of the Combe River, the places where shadows gathered longest at dusk. He noted which locks were weak with rust, which doors squeaked, which hinges had been oiled. He memorized the schedules of wagons, coming and going, the times when Nest inspected the ledgers, the hours when Jasper prowled the fields in search of excuses for violence. Each detail, however small, was filed away like a weapon. His grief for Ella, Lenina, and Dorinda did not fade. It calcified into fuel. He replayed their faces in his mind during long nights, not as memories to weep over, but as vows to keep. His sister's last look from the wagon, his mother's lifeless form in the straw. These were not wounds. They were markers, reminders that survival meant nothing if not turned toward something greater. In the long hours of tending the hounds, Simon found his strange apprenticeship deepening. The Hardings believed they had given him responsibility because of his natural connection with animals. In truth, they had given him access to the very instruments of their terror. He learned to read the hounds better than any man could. He understood which sense triggered frenzy, how hunger made them reckless, how a single distraction could break their focus. He knew when to push them, when to calm them, when to withhold food to make them savage, and when to feed them just enough to dull their senses. The pack was no longer just theirs. It was his in ways they would never understand. And all the while, whispers grew in the region. News of Nat Turner's rebellion decades earlier still lingered in the minds of both black and white Southerners. Rumors of escapes on the Underground Railroad floated down to plantations like seeds carried on wind. The Hardings dismissed such stories as distant threats, but in the quarters, hope was measured in whispers. To Simon, these were not merely tales. They were proof that the system could be challenged. Still, he was no fool. Recklessness meant death, not justice. His revenge would not be a sudden blaze that consumed him as well. It would be methodical, deliberate, patient, the kind of justice that mirrored the cruelty inflicted on his family. He would wait for the perfect season, the perfect opportunity. In silence, he built a plan. Each day, another brick laid in the foundation of vengeance. Garrett may have believed he ruled with efficiency, but he never noticed the quiet eyes watching him, calculating him. Ernest and Jasper may have believed Simon's bowed head was obedience, but they never saw the fire smoldering behind his calm expression. The Hardings had mistaken silence for loyalty, invisibility for submission. It was the mistake that would one day undo them. For now, Simon remained the perfect servant. He fed the hounds, he cleaned the kennels, he obeyed without question. But within him, the memory of his mother and sister was no longer just grief. It was strategy. It was patience. It was a vow waiting for its moment. And in the winter air of 1852, heavy with frost and silence, that moment was beginning to take shape. By the early 1850 seconds, the Harding plantation had settled into its rhythm of cruelty, one so predictable that those enslaved could count their days not by calendars, but by punishments. For Simon, these years were not wasted, they were preparation. Each hour of obedience was an investment, each moment of silence a tool sharpened for later use. He learned that in a world where every gesture was watched, invisibility was not only a shield, but a weapon. Garrett's rule as overseer made life brutal but structured. The lash still fell, but it fell by the clock as precise as the tolling of Jasper's morning bell. For Simon, this regularity was a gift. Chaos had defined Thorne's reign, making danger unpredictable. Under Garrett, violence became routine, which meant it could be studied, anticipated, and one day exploited. He perfected the art of listening without appearing to. Ernest Harding, with his business-like coldness, held meetings in the main house where he spoke freely of profits, debts, and expansion. Simon, quietly, feeding the dogs nearby, caught every word. Jasper bragged in the yard to merchants and neighbors about the fear. His hounds inspired. Simon, polishing harnesses within earshot, memorized. Details others ignored. Even Garrett, confident in his authority, sometimes muttered to himself as he walked the grounds. Each word, each careless remark, was folded into Simon's growing archive of knowledge. But Simon did not stop at listening. He experimented, small, subtle things at first, leaving a latch slightly looser than usual, just to note which hound pushed harder against it, changing the time of a meal by a few minutes to see how it affected their energy, swapping scraps of cloth between kennels to test how long a scent lingered. These were not acts of rebellion, but rehearsals. Rehearsals for a performance only he knew was coming. The plantation itself became his classroom. He memorized the way shadows fell on different days of the year, how moonlight silvered certain paths, how sound traveled across frozen ground. He marked the spots where trees grew thick enough to muffle a cry and where the river's current could carry evidence away. To Ernest and Jasper, Simon was a silent figure moving through chores. To himself he was a grapher of revenge, mapping every contour of opportunity. Yet, beyond the plantation gates, the world was changing. Newspapers spoke of compromises between North and South, of new territories, and the bitter question of whether they would bear free soil or slave chains. For the Hardings, such debates were abstractions, but for the enslaved they were sparks of possibility. In whispered conversations, after dark, names like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass surfaced, half understood but fully believed. It was said that in Charleston itself pamphlets circulated calling slavery a sin. Simon listened, but unlike others, he did not dream of escape. He was not content to vanish into freedom. His eyes were fixed on the very men who had destroyed his family. To flee would mean carrying hatred without release. To stay meant the chance to settle the ledger. His decision was made long before opportunity arrived. He would not run. He would remain silent and watchful until the day he could strike. The enslaved around him sometimes wondered at his stillness. He was neither reckless nor broken. He laughed rarely, spoke less, and avoided disputes that flared in the cabins. But when eyes met his in the flickering light of the fire, they often looked away first. There was something in his gaze, calm, unblinking, heavy, that unsettled even those who shared his suffering. 3 years passed this way. Each season another line in the blueprint Simon carried in his mind. And then, in the winter of 1852, tension crackled across the plantation, like frost snapping underfoot. Ernest spoke often of profits, boasting of another expansion. Jasper swaggered more, crewy than usual, intoxicated by the authority his father granted him. Garrett tightened surveillance, convinced the slaves were growing restless. The hounds themselves grew leaner, their hunger sharpened as cold, deepened. Simon could feel it in his bones. The perfect storm was gathering. He had memorized too much, prepared too, longed to doubt it now. The Hardings' arrogance blinded them, their cruelty distracted them, and the winter itself gave him cover. All that remained was to wait for the one event that would open the door to everything he had planned. And that event was already stirring in Charleston, where Adelaide Harding, Ernest's youngest daughter, was finishing her education and preparing to return home. Adelaide Harding returned to the plantation in December of 1852, stepping down from the carriage, not as the obedient child her father remembered, but as a young woman with thoughts that unsettled the very ground beneath the Harding estate. She was 19, her manner polished by 3 years at the Charleston Female Seminary, her eyes sharpened by lectures and conversations that Ernest Harding would have dismissed as dangerous nonsense. Among her tutors and classmates circulated ideas, whispered with careful caution, pamphlets, essays, even scripture interpreted through a lens that questioned slavery itself. Adelaide had listened, and more importantly, she had believed. At first, her change was subtle. She asked questions during meals, her voice soft but persistent. Why did punishments need to be so severe? Why did the slaves not eat what the family ate if they worked the same? Fields that fed the household's wealth? Why was it necessary to keep the hounds so lean, so brutal? Ernest waved her off, with the irritation of a man unused to being questioned in his own house. Jasper sneered, mocking her seminary fancies, insisting that book learning had clouded her common sense. Yet Adelaide did not retreat. Instead, she pressed further, and her presence began to disrupt the carefully maintained rhythm of terror. Her moment of crisis came only days after her return. A boy of 18, Joshua, was accused of stealing bacon. The charge was flimsy, little more than Garrett's suspicion, but on the Harding plantation, accusations required no proof. Ernest ordered a whipping. Adelaide was brought to the yard and seated beside her father, forced to watch. Garrett's whip sang through the air, tearing flesh from Joshua's back, and with each blow, Adelaide's face grew paler. When the 6th lash ripped skin to bone, she bent forward, wretched, and vomited in front of everyone, slave, master, overseer alike. For the enslaved, the moment was unforgettable. Here, for once, a white Harding recoiled from brutality. For Nest, it was a humiliation, proof his daughter was too weak to carry the family's legacy. He seized her arm and forced her to remain until the full punishment was complete, his grip iron, his gaze cold. Jasper laughed aloud, calling her soft as spoiled fruit. Adelaide endured, but the experience burned something permanent into her. What Ernest meant as indoctrination became rebellion. In the days that followed, Ernest doubled his efforts to cure her of weakness. He made her shadow Garrett, watch more punishments, and witness the hounds released on practice trails. Adelaide endured them all, but instead of learning hardness, she became more certain that slavery was evil. She began speaking to the slaves in hushed tones, asking about their families, their lives, their suffering. Her questions carried danger, but also something unfamiliar, sympathy. Simon watched her carefully. From his vantage point at the kennels or in the shadows of the yard, he observed every exchange. Adelaide fascinated him, not because he trusted her. He knew better than to trust any Harding, but because her defiance fractured the plantation's order. Ernest and Jasper, once united in cruelty, argued over how to handle her. Garrett muttered that her softness undermined discipline. Even the slaves whispered of her as both a risk and a strange new hope. Her breaking point came when Jasper ordered punishment for Mercy, a young girl who had dropped a porcelain dish. Garrett raised the whip, but before the first lash fell, Adelaide stood and shouted, "Stop!" Her voice carried across the yard like a bell tolling at the wrong hour. For a moment, Everything froze, the whip held mid-air, the slaves holding their breath, Garrett blinking in disbelief. Then chaos erupted. Jasper raged. Ernest thundered. Adelaide accused them both of being monsters. By the end of the confrontation, she was threatened with confinement, even whispers of being sent to an asylum for hysteria. Yet her defiance had done something more important than she realized. For the first time in years, the Hardings were distracted, consumed by family strife. Their vigilance slipped. Their attention, once fixed sharply on the slaves, turned inward. Ernest and Jasper spent long evenings debating Adelaide's fate, their voices raised behind shuttered windows. Garrett grumbled but obeyed, spreading himself thin across the duties they neglected. Simon recognized the shift instantly. It was the opening he had waited for, proof that even the most rigid system could crack from within. While Adelaide's rebellion threatened to undo her, it gave Simon the cover he needed to move unseen. What Adelaide did not know was that Simon had already begun whispering to Joshua, the boy whose back bore the fresh scars of Garrett's whip. Joshua's anger was raw, his pain unhealed, his desperation palpable, and Simon, with his cold, quiet patience, knew how to shape desperation into resolve. The pieces were falling into place. The Hounds still. Bar at night, the whip still cracked in the yard, but beneath the surface something had shifted. Ernest and Jasper could sense it, though they mistook the source as Adelaide's rebellion. They tightened their grip on her, blind to the real storm gathering in the shadows. Simon watched, silent as always, and thought of his mother and sister. The Hardings believed their power eternal. They could not yet see what Simon already knew. The ledger was about to be balanced. On the morning of the 10th of December, 1852, frost clung to the earth like shards of broken glass. Ernest and Jasper Harding prepared for their annual business trip to Charleston, unaware that the path they were about to take had already been chosen for them by another. The carriage stood ready, wheels groaning against the cold, horses stamping impatiently in the frozen dirt. They carried with them samples of cotton, stacks of ledgers, and the arrogance of men who believed themselves untouchable. Simon had memorized every step of this routine. He knew Ernest would check the straps twice. Jasper would fumble with his gloves, and Garrett would mutter about keeping order in their absence. What they did not know was that Simon had been preparing for this very morning for 3 long years. The winter air concealed more than their breath. It concealed intention. In the weeks before, Simon had whispered to Joshua, the boy who had nearly been whipped to death. Pain had hardened Joshua into someone willing to risk everything. Simon promised him not freedom, not yet, but something deeper, vengeance. Together they rehearsed silence, traded knowledge, and steeled themselves for the moment that would decide everything. The ambush site had been chosen with care. A mile from the plantation, the dirt road dipped into a thicket of pine and oak, where the canopy was so dense that even midday light struggled to pierce through. It was a place where sound was swallowed, where cries could not easily escape. Simon had walked this stretch countless times, memorizing every curve, every rock, every place where a body could hide. That morning he and Joshua moved like hunters. Their tools were simple but effective: a woodsman's axe, 2 butcher's knives, strong rope, and most important of all, a forgotten bear trap Simon had salvaged and restored in secret. They worked quickly, their breath fogging the air, their hands steady. The trap was set beneath a scattering of leaves, camouflaged with care. The forest grew silent, as though even nature waited for the moment to arrive. The sound of hooves came first, steady and careless. Then the rattle of the carriage. Ernest's voice carried through the cold air, discussing prices with Jasper, as though nothing in the world could touch them. When the carriage rolled over the hidden trap, a metallic snap echoed like a gunshot. The horses reared in panic. The carriage tilted violently, and Ernest and Jasper were thrown onto the frozen ground. Ernest screamed, his ankle mangled in the iron jaws of the trap. Jasper, dazed, tried to rise, but Simon was already upon him. He struck with the handle of the axe, knocking him back into the snow. Joshua pounced on Nest, gagging him with rope before his cries could carry. Within moments, both men were bound, helpless, their power stripped away as swiftly as a coat in winter wind. Simon did not kill them quickly. That was never the plan. Revenge to him was not a single strike. It was a process, a balancing of scales. He spoke to them calmly, almost gently, reminding them of every cruelty they had inflicted. He recited their crimes like scripture, the lashings, the starvation, the sale of his sister, the death of his mother. Jasper cursed through the gag. Nest's eyes widened with terror, but neither could escape the words any more than they could escape the ropes that held them. Joshua, scarred and trembling, took his turn. His blade drew shallow cuts across flesh, not enough to kill, but enough to make the pain unbearable. He had watched animals slaughtered his whole life. Now he applied the same brutal knowledge to men. The cold air slowed the bleeding, prolonging the agony. Ernest and Jasper writhed in the snow, their bodies jerking against restraints, their breaths shallow and ragged. When the final blows came, they were delivered with precision. Simon's axe fell, and with it ended 2 decades of cruelty. For a moment silence returned to the forest, broken only by the ragged breaths of the 2 avengers. Snowflakes drifted down, landing on the blood-darkened ground as though winter itself sought to cover the scene. But Simon knew the most dangerous part had only just begun. Revenge was not complete until every trace of it vanished. The bodies, the carriage, the belongings, all had to be erased. He and Joshua worked methodically, their movements rehearsed, their resolve unshaken. They dismembered the corpses, wrapped them in tarps, and prepared them for the next step in their plan, feeding the Hardings to their own hounds. As they labored, Simon's thoughts did not waver. He was not haunted by what he had done. To him, this was not murder. It was balance long overdue. The Hardings had ruled through. Fear had used dogs as their instruments of terror. Now those same dogs would become the agents of justice. The forest grew quiet once more, but it was no longer the quiet of winter. It was the quiet after judgment. The forest, still, bore the scars of that morning, the churned earth, the broken branches, the iron teeth of the trap now buried deep beneath fallen leaves. But as Simon and Joshua hauled their burden through the thickets, there was no time to admire the silence they had created. Revenge was only half complete. The greater challenge lay ahead, making sure that Ernest and Jasper Harding simply vanished. They moved swiftly, carrying the tarp-wrapped remains to the abandoned barn at the far edge of the plantation. There, hidden beneath rotting planks and cobwebbed rafters, Simon had stored barrels of salt, knives, and old cloth weeks in advance. Every detail had been accounted for. He knew that blood left unattended invited suspicion. He knew that bones could be found, clothes identified, horses tracked. The plan was not just to kill, it was to erase. The dismemberment was grim, brutal work. Neither Simon nor Joshua spoke. As the blades cut through sinew and bone, the cold worked in their favor, slowing decay, thickening blood into dark clots that spread less easily across the dirt. They cut not with precision, but with purpose, dividing the bodies into manageable pieces. Some were salted and sealed in barrels. Others were carried back through the woods under cover of night. And then came the final, most daring act. In the kennel, the bloodhounds waited, their eyes glinting in the lantern light, their ribs sharp from deliberate hunger. To every slave on the plantation. Those dogs were nightmares in flesh. But to Simon, they were instruments, tools he had studied, understood, and now turned against their masters. He fed them small portions at first, mixing human flesh with scraps of pork and beef. The dogs devoured without hesitation, their jaws cracking bone, with the same ease they had once broken fugitive slaves. Over 2 nights, Ernest and Jasper Harding ceased to exist, consumed by the very beasts they had once used as weapons of fear. The irony was not lost on Simon. It was the ultimate inversion of power. The Hardings, who had fed terror into the mouths of dogs, had themselves become food. For Simon, it was not cruelty, but poetry, justice written in flesh, and hunger. When daylight came, Simon resumed his routine with flawless calm. He cleaned the kennels, swept away traces of blood, and carried himself with the same submissive silence that had always fooled the Hardings. Joshua too returned to the fields, his body bent under the same labors, his face betraying nothing. The 2 men never exchanged words in public, never allowed even a glance to betray their secret. What neither of them expected was Adelaide, freed from her father and brother's constant oversight. She began to make quiet changes in their absence. She suspended public punishments, insisting Garrett hold his lash. She ordered better rations for the slaves, small increases, but enough to be noticed. She walked the quarters without a whip or overseer, speaking to the enslaved as though they were human beings. The atmosphere shifted cautiously, tentatively, but undeniably. Fear loosened its grip, if only for a while. For Simon, this change was both a blessing and a complication. On one hand, Adelaide's reforms created cover. The slaves were calmer, more cooperative, which made suspicion less likely. On the other hand, her presence stirred unease. She was observant. She noticed silences, sidelong glances, changes in routine, and she had already begun to suspect that something was brewing beneath the surface. Still, Simon held his mask. He fed the dogs, carried water, bowed his head. Adelaide's eyes sometimes lingered on him, curious, perhaps even sympathetic. But Simon could not afford sympathy. His plan was not yet finished. The carriage fragments still had to be hidden. The clothing scattered, the last traces of Ernest and Jasper erased, and so by night he and Joshua slipped into the woods to bury remnants, scattering pieces across miles of forest so no trail could be followed. 10 days passed and whispers began to grow louder. Ernest and Jasper had not returned. Merchants expected in Charleston claimed they never arrived. Garrett began to pace the grounds with a furrowed brow, muttering to himself. Adelaide, though estranged from her father and brothers, cruelty could not hide her worry. She ordered letters sent, messengers dispatched, inquiries made, but no word came back. In the quarters, the silence was different. The enslaved knew, or at least they suspected, they had seen Simon and Joshua's faces, the strange calm that hung over them. They had noticed the way the dogs were hungrier than usual and the strange meat that had been mixed in with their meals. Yet no one spoke, not to Garrett, not to Adelaide, not to the sheriff who would soon arrive. Silence was their collective shield, their way of saying, justice had been done, and we will guard it. Simon knew the danger was not over. The absence of Ernest and Jasper would draw scrutiny, and scrutiny was always deadly, but for now the plan had held. The Hardings were gone. The plantation carried on, and no one, not Garrett, not Adelaide, not even the dogs, themselves could reveal the truth. For the first time in years, Simon allowed himself to feel a flicker of something he had almost forgotten, not freedom, not joy, but the faintest taste of control. And in a world built on domination, that was enough to keep his resolve steady. The forest had taken Ernest and Jasper Harding. The hounds had swallowed them whole, and the truth for now belonged only to those who knew how to keep it. The Harding plantation could no longer mask the absence of its masters. By the 20th of December, 10 days after Ernest and Jasper's departure, unease seeped into every corner of the estate. Overseer Garrett, who had at first enjoyed the freedom of command, now paced the veranda with restless suspicion. The ledgers grew, heavier with unanswered debts. Merchants arrived only to leave dissatisfied, and whispers spread like frost over bare fields. Adelaide, still caught between fear for her family and conviction in her new abolitionist sympathies, felt an unshakable dread. Something was deeply wrong. Garrett decided to act. Saddling his horse, he set off along the road to Charleston, intent on tracing the Hardings' path. What he found unsettled him more than their absence. In Beaufort, the first town along the way, the innkeeper shook his head. Ernest and Jasper had never arrived. Merchants confirmed the same. No one had seen them since they left their plantation. The road, usually busy with traders and travelers, had swallowed them whole. Garrett pressed on, but every mile told the same story. The Hardings had vanished without a trace. When he returned to the plantation on the 23rd of December, his news sent shock waves through Adelaide. Though she had argued bitterly with her father and brother, she could not imagine they would vanish voluntarily. Ernest, meticulous in business, would never leave correspondence unanswered. Jasper, impulsive though he was, would never miss the chance to flaunt wealth in Charleston. Their silence was unnatural. With a trembling hand, Adelaide wrote to relatives and sent riders to neighboring estates, pleading for any word. None came. By Christmas, local authorities became involved. Sheriff Thomas Whitmore arrived on the 25th of December with 2 deputies and a seasoned tracker named Ezra Collins. Whitmore was no stranger to violence at 45. He had investigated murders, thefts, and slave uprisings, but nothing could prepare him for what he would uncover in the Harding woods. The investigation began with methodical questions. Adelaide, pale but composed, recounted her father's departure. Garrett provided details of the carriage, the route, and the time. The enslaved were questioned one by one, their faces expressionless, their answers rehearsed. They knew nothing, had seen nothing, had heard nothing. Whitmore, sharp-eyed, recognized a wall of silence but could not yet breach it. Collins. The tracker moved to the road itself, where his trained eyes spotted what others had missed. Carriage wheel ruts pressed deep into the mud, ending abruptly where the forest thickened. Nearby the ground was torn and churned. Branches broken, soil darkened with stains that had soaked too deep to be rain. Collins crouched low, lifted a scrap of fabric snagged on a bush, and held it up. It matched the coat Jasper had been wearing when he left. He also found fragments of rusted iron remnants of the bear trap. The discovery shifted the investigation from disappearance to presumed murder. Whitmore called for a larger search party. Over the next 2 days, men scoured the woods, their boots crunching over frozen earth, their torches throwing long shadows across the pines. They uncovered fragments of clothing buried shallowly, shards of the carriage hidden in a ravine, and most chilling of all bones. Some were large, unmistakably human. Others were smaller, gnawed and marked as though by crude knives. Dr. Harrison, the local physician, examined the remains. He confirmed what Whitmore already feared. These were human bones severed with rough tools consistent with butchery rather than accident. Some bore marks of teeth, not animal scavengers from the wild, but dogs, large, powerful dogs. The implication was horrifying. Whoever had killed Ernest and Jasper had fed their remains to the plantation's own bloodhounds. The sheriff turned his suspicions to the enslaved. He interrogated them relentlessly, circling, back with the same questions, watching for slips. Joshua, his back still, scarred from Garrett's whip, trembled during questioning, his hands shaking, his eyes refusing to meet Whitmore's gaze. The sheriff smelled guilt on him, but guilt was not proof. Simon, however, presented a different challenge. Calm, differential, his answers precise. He explained the blood on his clothes as pig slaughter for feeding the dogs. Other slaves corroborated the story. His tone betrayed no fear, his eyes no flicker of deceit. Yet Whitmore's instincts told him the truth lay somewhere behind that silence. Simon was the Hounds' keeper, the one man with access, knowledge, and opportunity. The final discovery came in the kennels themselves. Collins sweeping through, the frozen soil, unearthed bone fragments buried shallowly among the runs. They were small, brittle, yet Dr. Harrison confirmed their resemblance to human remains. The bloodhounds barked and snapped at the investigators as if protecting a secret. Whitmore's face hardened. He was not dealing with a simple murder. This was a crime of vengeance, calculated and grotesque. The plantation became a hive of fear. Adelaide's nerves frayed under the weight of horror. Though she tried to maintain control, Garrett cursed the silence of the slaves. Whitmore pressed harder, threatening punishments, and still no one spoke. In that silence was unity, a dangerous unity. For the enslaved, Simon's revenge was not betrayal, but justice, and justice was worth protecting. The investigation stalled. Whitmore had evidence of violence, fragments of bodies, and suspicions as sharp as knives, but no confession, no witness willing to betray the guilty, and every day that passed without answers only deepened the mystery. In the first weeks of January, whispers of revolt spread from plantation to plantation. White owners feared the Hardings' fate was a warning, a message written in blood and silence. But within the quarters of Harding plantation, the whispers carried a different tone. They were not whispers of fear, they were whispers of triumph. By January of 1853, the Harding plantation was unraveling. The investigation had reached a dead end. Sheriff Whitmore remained convinced that Simon was the key, that behind his quiet eyes lay the truth of Ernest and Jasper's fate. Yet, without confession or witness testimony, law turned to smoke. The enslaved had formed an unspoken pact: protect Simon at all costs. Each interrogation was met with silence, every question deflected with shrugs or lies rehearsed in the dim glow of cabin fires. It was more than fear, it was solidarity, a communal decision that Simon's act of vengeance belonged not just to him, but to all of them. Whitmore pressed harder. Rewards were offered for information, punishments threatened, even promises of freedom whispered in hopes of breaking loyalty. None worked. The quarters understood something the sheriff did not. Simon had not only avenged himself, he had avenged them all. His justice was their justice, and betrayal would mean betraying the only moment in years where power had shifted in their favor. Then, in the night of the 12th of January, Simon and Joshua vanished. At dawn, when Simon failed to appear at the kennels of duty, he had never neglected. Panic rippled through the plantation. Their cabins were empty, their few belongings gone. The cold had swallowed their tracks, leaving only silence behind. Whitmore cursed. Garrett raged. Adelaide trembled. But there was nothing to follow. Two men had slipped from the very heart of the estate, carrying the secret of their vengeance with them. Their disappearance confirmed what Whitmore had suspected, but suspicion could not be justice. With no bodies, no confessions, and no captives, the case remained unsolved. Wanted posters were nailed in nearby towns, descriptions spread across counties, but winter's roads were wide and unforgiving. Simon and Joshua dissolved into rumor, into the imagination of those who wanted them caught and those who wanted them free. Adelaide was left to face the ruins of her family. The discovery that her father and brother had been slaughtered, their remains fed to the very dogs they once used to terrorize, shattered something in her. The image haunted her until she could no longer bear it. Within days, she ordered the Hounds destroyed, unable to stomach their howls, or the thought of their jaws gnashing through human bone. But her decision that shocked the South came on the 20th of January against the council of relatives, lawyers, and neighbors. Adelaide freed all 22 enslaved people of the Harding estate. She signed the documents with a steady hand, declaring slavery an abomination that had destroyed her family from within. It was an act as radical as it was ruinous. The plantation collapsed overnight, its value gutted, its labor force vanished into freedom. Other slaveholders whispered in horror, branding her unstable, dangerous, a traitor to her class. She was ostracized, cut off, and eventually left the South entirely, moving north to join abolitionist circles until her death years later. She never returned to Beaufort County. As for Simon and Joshua, their fate became legend. Some said they made their way south, vanishing into maroon communities hidden deep in Florida's swamps. Others swore they traveled north, blending into free black settlements under new names. A few insisted they parted ways, each carving a separate path through freedom's dangerous terrain. Nordra, no certainty remains. What endured was the story. In the decades that followed, as the Civil War loomed and slavery's end approached, whispers of Simon's revenge traveled among freedmen and their descendants. They told it around fires, in church gatherings, at family tables. They told of the boy who had fed his masters to their own hounds, of the silence of a community that shielded him, of the young accomplice who had bled but not broken. It became less a tale of murder than of justice, the kind, denied by law but claimed by those who had nothing left to lose. By the 1880s, when former slaves of the Harding estate grew old, fragments of the truth began to surface openly. They spoke of Ella, Lanina, sold in her pregnancy, of Dorinda, her spirit broken, of Simon, whose silence was not submission but calculation. They described the ambush on that frozen road, the iron jaws of the trap, the axes and knives, the feeding of flesh to hounds. For them it was not a horror story. It was a testament even the most powerful could fall. The Harding estate itself faded into ruin. The fields went wild. The big house crumbled, and by the early 20th century only stone foundations remained. Locals avoided the site, claiming the woods were haunted by uneasy whispers, by howls that did not belong to wolves. But among African American communities in the South, Simon's name was remembered differently. He was not a ghost to be feared, but a hero to be honored. His revenge was told as proof that justice could rise from the ashes of oppression, that silence could be more dangerous than shouting, and that even chains could not extinguish the fire of a man who refused to forget. One former Harding slave interviewed in 1895 put it simply, "Simon did what we all dreamed of. He made them feel what they made us feel. He gave us justice when the world never would." History books never recorded the story of Simon. It lived instead in whispers, in legends, in the memory of those who had once been voiceless. His revenge was not written in ink, but in silence, in blood, and in the freedom of those who survived him. And so, when the last of the old slaves spoke his name to children who had never known chains, Simon ceased to be just a man. He became a symbol of patience, of vengeance, of the truth that even the strongest walls of oppression can crack when struck by hands that have waited long enough.